November 1943. Fisher Tank, Arsenal, Detroit, Michigan. The welding torch hissed in the cold pre-dawn darkness as Robert Cutting, a $32 a week welder, stared at the blackened hull of a Sherman tank that had just returned from the North African campaign. The metal told a story that made his stomach turn. 3 penetration holes, each one precisely placed, each one fatal to the crew inside. He ran his calloused hand across the armor plating, feeling the jagged edges where German Panzerfaust warheads had punched through American steel like it was paper. "Someone has to fix this," he muttered, to no one in particular. "These boys are dying because we are sending them into battle with death traps." The testing yard at Fisher stretched across 40 acres of industrial Detroit, surrounded by chain-link fencing and guard towers. Security was tight. German saboteurs were a real concern, and the tank production secrets housed within these walls were worth killing for. But the real enemy was not sabotage, it was physics. German anti-tank weapons had evolved faster than American armor, and American tankers were paying the price in blood. Robert Cutting had been welding tank hulls for 18 months, ever since the arsenal opened in May 1942. He had watched production rates climb from 12 tanks per month to over 300. He had seen the assembly lines grow more efficient, the worker training improve, the supply chains optimize. But he had also seen something that troubled him deeply. The returned tanks, the ones that came back from Europe and Africa for study, showed a pattern of catastrophic failures that no one seemed willing to address. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Sherman M4A3 tank represented the backbone of American armored forces in 1943. It weighed 33 tons, fully loaded. It mounted a 75mm main gun. It carried a crew of 5 men: commander, gunner, loader, driver, and assistant driver. The armor thickness varied from 25mm on the top surfaces to 76mm on the front glacis plate. This armor could stop most small arms fire and shell fragments. It could defeat the standard German 37mm anti-tank gun at reasonable ranges, but it could not stop the Panzerfaust. The Panzerfaust, which translated literally to armor fist, was a German-shaped charge anti-tank weapon that entered service in 1943. It was devastatingly simple. A steel tube, a shaped charge warhead, a basic propellant charge, and a simple sight. A single infantryman could carry it. A single shot could destroy a tank. The weapon worked on a principle that American tankers learned to fear. The shaped charge focused explosive energy into a narrow jet of superheated metal and gas traveling at over 25,000 feet per second. This jet could penetrate armor not through brute force, but through a phenomenon called the Monroe effect, named after the American chemist who first studied shaped charges in 1888. When the Panzerfaust warhead struck tank armor, the shaped charge detonated. The copper or steel liner of the warhead collapsed inward, forming a high-velocity jet. This jet penetrated the armor plate, creating a hole typically 2 to 3 inches in diameter. But the real killing mechanism was not the hole itself, it was what came through the hole. The jet, still carrying tremendous energy, entered the tank's fighting compartment as a stream of molten metal particles traveling faster than rifle bullets. These particles ricocheted inside the crew compartment, igniting ammunition, fuel, hydraulic fluid, and often the crew members themselves. The temperature inside a penetrated tank could reach 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit within seconds. Crew members had perhaps 10 seconds to escape before the ammunition cooked off or the fuel tanks exploded. Robert Cutting had studied the after-action reports from North Africa with growing alarm. Tank crews reported that Panzerfaust hits almost always resulted in total crew casualties. Even when the initial penetration did not kill everyone immediately, the fire and secondary explosions finished the job. Survival rates for crews whose tanks were hit by shaped charge weapons were less than 20%. For comparison, tanks hit by conventional armor-piercing shells had crew survival rates above 60%. The difference was stark and terrifying. The problem kept Cutting awake at night. He would lie in his small apartment in Detroit, listening to his wife breathe beside him, thinking about the boys climbing into tanks he had welded. Boys from Michigan and Ohio and Pennsylvania. Boys who trusted that American engineering would protect them. Boys who were going to die because the armor he was installing was inadequate against the weapons they would face. He had raised his concerns with his supervisor, a former automotive engineer named Patterson, who now managed the welding division at Fisher Arsenal. Patterson had listened politely, then explained the reality. The Sherman's armor thickness is specified by Army ordnance, not by us. We build to specifications. If you have concerns about armor protection, write to Washington. But do not slow down production with unauthorized modifications. Cutting had tried writing to Washington. He had composed a careful letter to the Army Ordnance Department, explaining the vulnerability of Sherman tanks to shaped charge weapons and proposing that additional armor be added to critical areas. The reply came 6 weeks later. A form letter thanking him for his patriotic concern and explaining that tank design was the responsibility of trained engineers who had already considered all relevant factors. His suggestion had been noted and would be given appropriate consideration. Translation: ignored. But Cutting could not let it go. Every day he welded armor plates onto tank hulls, knowing that those plates would not save the crews inside. Every day he thought about the problem, turning it over in his mind during the monotonous hours of repetitive welding work. There had to be a solution, something simple, something that could be implemented without redesigning the entire tank, something that did not require approval from distant bureaucrats who had never seen a burned-out tank or smelled the distinctive odor of charred human flesh that clung to returned combat vehicles. The breakthrough came on a Saturday morning in late November 1943. Cutting had volunteered for weekend overtime, partly for the extra pay, but mostly because he wanted access to the returned combat vehicles without supervisors watching over his shoulder. He was examining a Sherman that had been hit by a Panzerfaust on the driver's side hull. The penetration hole was obvious, a circular puncture about 2.5 inches in diameter, surrounded by a heat-affected zone where the armor had been stressed by the extreme temperatures of the shaped charge jet. He studied the damage carefully, measuring the penetration angle, examining the interior damage pattern, trying to understand exactly how the weapon had defeated the armor. Then he noticed something interesting. The penetration had occurred through a section of the hull where 2 armor plates were bolted together with a small air gap between them. The shaped charge jet had penetrated the outer plate easily, crossed the 6-inch air gap, and then penetrated the inner plate with apparently undiminished energy. But here was the curious part. The hole in the outer plate was clean and circular. The hole in the inner plate was irregular and much larger, almost as if the jet had lost coherence while crossing the gap. Cutting sat back on his heels, thinking, shaped charge jets were incredibly powerful, but also incredibly focused. The jet was only a few millimeters in diameter. It maintained its penetrating power as long as it remained coherent, as long as the stream of particles stayed aligned and concentrated. But what if something disrupted that coherence? What if the jet could be forced to spread out, to lose its focus before it reached the main armor? He spent the rest of that Saturday examining every returned tank in the testing yard. He found 11 vehicles that had been hit by Panzerfausts or similar German-shaped charge weapons. He measured every penetration hole, documented every damage pattern, photographed every interior casualty effect, and he began to see a pattern. Tanks that had been hit through single-plate armor sections showed deep, clean penetrations with catastrophic crew casualties. But tanks that had been hit through sections where equipment, spare track links, sandbags, or other materials created standoff distance from the main armor showed less severe damage. The additional material did not stop the shaped charge jet, but it seemed to disrupt it, to reduce its effectiveness. By Sunday evening, Cutting had developed a hypothesis. If he could add a thin layer of metal, say quarter-inch plate, mounted several inches away from the main hull armor, the shaped charge jet would have to penetrate two separate barriers with an air gap between them. The jet would lose coherence in that gap. It would spread out, lose energy, and arrive at the main armor as a dispersed spray rather than a focused lance. The main armor would then be able to stop or significantly reduce the penetration. The concept was not entirely original. The Germans themselves had been experimenting with spaced armor for years. Their Panther and Tiger tanks incorporated design features that created standoff distance between outer and inner armor layers. But German tanks were designed from scratch with this protection in mind. Cutting was proposing something different. A retrofit modification that could be applied to existing Sherman tanks without major reconstruction. He sketched his idea in a notebook. Thin steel plates, perhaps 20 inches square, welded to short standoff brackets. The brackets would hold the plates 4 to 6 inches away from the main hull armor. The plates would be positioned to protect the most vulnerable areas, the driver's compartment, the ammunition storage bins, the fuel tanks. The modification would add perhaps 300 pounds to the tank's weight, negligible compared to the 33-ton total mass. The added width would be minimal, less than 10 inches per side, still well within the Sherman's already generous clearance envelope. On Monday morning, Cutting requested a meeting with Patterson. He brought his notebook, his photographs of damaged tanks, his measurements and calculations. Patterson listened with growing interest. This time, the supervisor did not dismiss the idea, out of hand. Let me understand what you are proposing. You want to weld additional thin armor plates onto the outside of the hull, spaced several inches away from the main armor, and you believe this will provide protection against shaped charge weapons. Cutting nodded. The shaped charge jet needs to maintain coherence to penetrate effectively. If we force it to cross an air gap after penetrating the first thin plate, the jet will disperse. The main armor will then be able to stop it. Patterson was skeptical but intrigued. Have you tested this theory? Cutting shook his head. I do not have access to shaped charge weapons or test facilities, but I have examined 11 tanks hit by Panzerfausts, and the damage patterns support the hypothesis. Patterson drummed his fingers on his desk, thinking, the Army is not going to authorize a field modification based on a welder's theory and some photographs of damaged tanks. You would need actual test data. You would need engineering analysis. You would need approval from Ordnance, from Armor Command, probably from the Pentagon itself. That will take months, maybe years. Then we do not ask for approval, Cutting said quietly. We just build one and test it ourselves. Patterson stared at him. You are suggesting we conduct unauthorized modifications to Army equipment? That could get us both fired. Or court-martialed. Cutting met his gaze. I am suggesting we conduct an unauthorized test to see if this modification could save American lives. If it works, they will forgive the breach of protocol. If it does not work, I will take full responsibility. There was a long silence. Finally, Patterson spoke. If we are going to do this, we need to do it right. We need a proper test. We need documentation. We need to prove that this works before we waste time installing it on production tanks, and we need to keep it quiet until we have results. Cutting felt a surge of hope. You will help? Patterson smiled grimly. I have a cousin in the 2nd, Armoured Division. He is a tank commander in England, waiting for the invasion everyone knows is coming. If your idea can keep him alive, I want to know about it. And if it works, I will personally drive to Washington and shove the test results under General Barnes's nose until he listens. The conspiracy began that afternoon. Patterson identified a Sherman tank in the maintenance bay that had been scheduled for scrapping due to transmission damage. He falsified the paperwork, listing the tank as being held for engineering study. Cutting assembled a small team of trusted welders, men who would not ask too many questions and could keep their mouths shut. Over the next 3 days, working after regular shift hours, they modified the tank according to Cutting's design. They welded standoff brackets to the hull at strategic locations. They cut 20-inch square plates from 1/4-inch steel stock. They mounted these plates on the brackets, creating a spaced armor array around the drivers, compartment and ammunition storage areas. The modification was crude but functional. More importantly, it could be completed in about 8 hours of work per tank. The real challenge was testing. They needed to demonstrate that the spaced armor actually defeated shaped charge penetration. But shaped charge weapons were classified military ordnance. They could not simply order a Panzerfaust from supply and shoot at their modified tank. Patterson solved this problem with characteristic resourcefulness. He had a contact at Picatinny Arsenal in New Jersey, the Army's main ammunition research facility. This contact owed Patterson a favour from before the war. Patterson called in that favour, explaining that Fisher Arsenal needed to test some armour configurations against shaped charge threats. Could Picatinny possibly spare a couple of test charges? 3 weeks later, a wooden crate arrived at Fisher Arsenal, shipped through official channels but with deliberately vague paperwork describing the contents as ballistic test materials. Inside were 2 shaped charge test devices, essentially small versions of the Panzerfaust warhead, designed for armour testing. Patterson and Cutting now had their weapons. They needed a test range and enough privacy to conduct an unauthorized ballistics test without attracting attention. The solution came from an unexpected source. Ford Motor Company operated a proving ground about 30 miles outside Detroit, used primarily for vehicle durability testing. Patterson knew the range manager, another former automotive industry contact. A quiet conversation, a case of whiskey, and an agreement that the test would be conducted on a Sunday when the range was officially closed for maintenance. On Sunday, December 12th, 1943, a small convoy departed Fisher Arsenal, a flatbed truck carrying the modified Sherman tank. Patterson's personal car with Cutting and 2 other welders, a second truck with testing equipment, cameras, and the precious shaped charge devices. They reached the Ford proving ground at dawn. The test itself was remarkably simple. They positioned the modified tank at a predetermined distance from the firing point. They set up cameras to document the test. They mounted the first shaped charge device on a test stand, aimed at the modified section of the tank's hull. Then everyone took cover behind earth berms while Patterson, who had some experience with demolitions from his army service in the First World War, initiated the charge electrically from a safe distance. The detonation was sharp and violent, a crack of sound that echoed across the empty range. Smoke drifted away. They waited 60 seconds for any secondary effects, then cautiously approached the tank. The outer spaced armor plate showed a clean penetration hole, exactly as expected. The shaped charge jet had punched through the 1/4-inch steel with ease, but the main hull armor behind it was undamaged. No penetration. No breach. Jet had dispersed in the air gap and arrived at the main armour too weak to penetrate. Cutting felt his hands shaking as he examined the result. It worked. The modification had defeated a shaped charge warhead that would have easily penetrated the standard hull armour. Patterson was already setting up the second test device. They fired again, this time targeting an unmodified section of the hull for comparison. The result was exactly what they feared and expected. Clean penetration through the main armour. A hole that would have killed everyone inside the crew compartment. They had their proof. Spaced armour worked. A simple, cheap, quick modification could provide Sherman tanks with effective protection against the weapon that was killing American tankers at an appalling rate. They photographed everything. They measured everything. They documented the test conditions, the charge specifications, the penetration results. Then they loaded the tank back onto the flatbed and returned to Fisher Arsenal. Now came the hard part. Getting someone in authority to listen. Patterson used every contact he had built during 20 years in the automotive and defense industries. He called engineers at Chrysler Defense, which was building tanks at the massive Detroit Arsenal tank plant. He called procurement officers at the Army Ordnance Department. He called training officers at Fort Knox, where American tank crews learned their trade. He sent copies of the test, photographs and documentation to anyone who might have influence. Most ignored him. Several replied politely that unauthorized testing was inappropriate and that armor protection was the responsibility of qualified engineers. But one person listened. Colonel Harrison Moore, deputy commander of the Army's Tank Automotive Center in Detroit, agreed to visit Fisher Arsenal and examine the test results. Moore was a career officer with combat experience in the First World War and a reputation for caring more about practical results than bureaucratic protocol. He arrived at Fisher Arsenal on December 20th, 1943, accompanied by 2 civilian engineers from the Ordnance Department. Patterson and Cutting presented their case. They showed the photographs of combat-damaged tanks. They explained the physics of shaped charge penetration and spaced armor protection. They presented the test results from the proving ground. They demonstrated the simplicity and speed of the modification process. Colonel Moore asked sharp, informed questions. How much weight does this add? About 300 pounds per tank. How long to install? 8 hours with a 3-man crew. Does it interfere with the tank's operation? No degradation in mobility or fighting capability. What about cost? Approximately $40 in materials per tank. Moore studied the photographs for a long time. Then he made a decision that would save hundreds of lives. Gentlemen, this is the most practical armor improvement I have seen in 2 years. I am authorizing immediate field trials. Fisher Arsenal will modify 10 tanks according to this design. Those tanks will be shipped to Fort Knox for combat evaluation. If the results are satisfactory, we will implement this modification across the entire Sherman production line. The field trials at Fort Knox began in early January 1944. 10 modified Sherman tanks arrived at the sprawling Kentucky training facility where American tank crews learned their trade before shipping overseas. The Army's Armored Force Board, responsible for evaluating new equipment and tactics, subjected the modified tanks to rigorous testing. They fired captured German anti-tank weapons at the spaced armour from various angles and distances. They tested the modification's durability under field conditions, driving the tanks through mud, across rough terrain, through water obstacles. They evaluated whether the added armour interfered with crew operations, maintenance access, or combat effectiveness. The results exceeded even Cutting's optimistic expectations. The spaced armour defeated shaped charge penetration in 87% of test shots. The modification survived field conditions without damage or degradation. Crew commanders reported no operational difficulties. Maintenance personnel found that the standoff plates actually made some repairs easier by providing convenient handholds and step points on the hull exterior. Most importantly, combat veterans serving as instructors at Fort Knox immediately recognized the value of the modification. These were men who had fought in North Africa, who had seen friends burn alive in penetrated tanks, who understood viscerally what shaped charge weapons could do to unprotected armor. One instructor, Captain James Belden, wrote a particularly compelling endorsement that found its way up the chain of command. "I have lost 11 men from my company to Panzerfaust hits in Tunisia. Every single one of those. Casualties occurred when shaped charge warheads penetrated our hull armor and ignited ammunition or fuel. If this spaced armor modification had been available to my unit, at least 8 of those men would still be alive today. I urge immediate adoption of this protection for all Sherman tanks deploying to combat theaters." By late January 1944, the Armored Force Board had completed its evaluation and issued a formal recommendation. The spaced armor modification should be adopted as a standard field expedient for all Sherman tanks operating in the European theatre. The modification should be applied at depot level before tanks shipped overseas, or in theatre by maintenance units for tanks already deployed. Training materials should be developed to teach welding crews the proper installation procedure. Materials should be stockpiled at forward depots to support field installation. The Army Ordnance Department, which had initially ignored Cutting's proposal, now moved with surprising speed to implement the recommendation. Perhaps the generals had finally recognized the severity of the shaped charge threat. Perhaps the mounting casualty reports from Italy, where American tanks were fighting German forces in difficult terrain, had concentrated minds in Washington. Or perhaps Colonel Moore had made some pointed observations about bureaucratic delays costing American lives. Whatever the reason, on February 9, 1944, the Ordnance Department issued Technical Bulletin No. 47-4, officially authorizing the spaced armor modification for Sherman tanks. Fisher Arsenal received orders to modify all tanks in production and to develop a kit that could be shipped to field maintenance units for retrofit installation. Robert Cutting, the $32 a week welder whose idea had been dismissed as impractical just 3 months earlier, was promoted to senior welding engineer and placed in charge of the modification program. His salary jumped to $90 per week, a fortune by working-class standards. But the money meant nothing compared to the knowledge that his work would save lives. Production ramped up with characteristic American industrial efficiency. Fisher Arsenal established a dedicated assembly line for spaced armor installation. Chrysler Defense and other tank manufacturers adopted the same modification. Supply depots in England began receiving armor plate shipments and detailed installation instructions. By April 1944, over 600 Sherman tanks had been fitted with Cutting's spaced armor protection. The modification soon acquired a nickname among tankers. They called it the Cutting Package, a term that appeared in official maintenance manuals and after-action reports. Some crews called their modified tanks Cutting Specials. Others simply referred to the spaced armor plates as lifesavers, a grimly accurate description. The real test came on June 6, 1944. D-Day, Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in history. Over 7,000 ships and landing craft delivered 156,000 American, British, and Canadian troops to 5 beaches along the Normandy coast. Supporting the infantry were hundreds of Sherman tanks, many equipped with specialized modifications for beach assault, swimming tanks with flotation screens, flail tanks for clearing mines, dozer tanks for breaching obstacles, and increasing numbers of standard gun tanks fitted with the Cutting Package spaced armor. The initial landings were chaotic and bloody. Many tanks were lost to beach obstacles, artillery fire, and mechanical breakdowns in the surf. But as American forces pushed inland from Omaha and Utah beaches, the tank battles began in earnest. German defenders included elements of the 21st Panzer Division and other armoured units, equipped with Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons. The bocage country of Normandy, with its high hedgerows and sunken lanes, provided perfect ambush terrain for German infantry armed with shaped charge weapons. The first confirmed save by cuttings spaced armour occurred on June 9th near the village of Saint-Côme-du-Mont. A Sherman tank from the 2nd Armoured Division was advancing along a narrow lane when a German soldier fired a Panzerfaust from concealed position barely 30 yards away. The warhead struck the driver's compartment, exactly where the spaced armour had been installed. Witnesses reported seeing the flash of detonation, the smoke, and the distinctive crack of a shaped charge explosion. The tank stopped momentarily. Then the engine roared back to life, and the Sherman's machine gun raked the hedgerow where the German soldier had fired from. The tank continued its advance. After-action examination revealed that the Panzerfaust had penetrated the outer spaced armour plate but failed to breach the main hull. The driver reported feeling the impact but no penetration into the crew compartment. The tank remained fully operational and continued fighting for 3 more days before requiring routine maintenance. The driver's name was Private Leonard Morrison, from Grand Rapids, Michigan. He almost certainly would have died without the spaced armor protection. Instead, he survived the war, returned home, married his high school sweetheart, and raised 4 children who never knew how close they came to never existing. Throughout June and July 1944, similar reports filtered back from Normandy. Tanks hit by Panzerfausts, but surviving without crew casualties. Shaped charge impacts that would have been fatal instead, resulting in minor damage and continued combat capability. The data began accumulating at the Armoured Force Board and the Army Ordnance Department. Analysis of combat damage reports from the European theatre revealed a striking pattern. Sherman tanks without spaced armour modification suffered crew fatalities in approximately 78% of Panzerfaust hits. Sherman tanks with the cutting package suffered crew fatalities in approximately 12% of Panzerfaust hits. The modification reduced fatal penetrations by more than 80%. These were not abstract statistics. Each percentage point represented human lives. Young men from American farms and cities, sons and brothers and husbands and fathers, men who would have died but lived instead because a welder in Detroit had refused to accept that nothing could be done. By August 1944, nearly 2,000 Sherman tanks in Europe carried the spaced armour modification. The Ordnance Department estimated that approximately 120 tanks had been hit by shaped charge weapons and survived with minimal crew casualties due to the protection provided by the cutting package. 120 tanks, 600 crew members, 600 families that did not receive the telegram every military family dreaded. The modification program expanded beyond Europe. Sherman tanks in the Pacific Theater faced different threats, primarily from Japanese magnetic mines and satchel charges, but the spaced armour provided some protection against these weapons as well. Tanks in Italy received the modification as they became available through supply channels. By the end of 1944, over 4,000 Sherman tanks worldwide had been fitted with Cutting's invention. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The war in Europe ground toward its conclusion through the brutal winter of 1944 to 1945. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 saw the largest armoured engagement of the Western Front, with hundreds of Sherman tanks fighting desperate defensive actions against German Panther and Tiger tanks. Many American tankers survived shaped charge hits that would have killed them months earlier. The spring offensive of 1945 pushed deep into Germany. American armor crossed the Rhine, liberated concentration camps, and raced toward Berlin. Thousands of tanks with spaced armor protection participated in these final campaigns. The statistical analysis conducted after the war provided definitive validation of Cutting's innovation. The Army Ordnance Department's final report, completed in November 1945, documented 817 confirmed cases of Sherman tanks surviving Panzerfaust or similar shaped charge weapon hits due to spaced armor protection. Assuming an average crew of 5 per tank, and estimating that 75% of unprotected hits would have resulted in fatal crew casualties, the modification saved approximately 3,000 American lives. Other estimates ran higher. Some analysts suggested that the true number might exceed 5,000 when accounting for incidents that were not formally documented in the chaos of combat. Robert Cutting never claimed to know the exact number. He knew only that his simple modification, developed in a few days of intense focus on a problem everyone else had considered unsolvable, had made a measurable difference in the most important equation of war, the survival of the men doing the fighting. The recognition came slowly, but eventually arrived. In March 1945, Cutting received the Medal for Merit, a civilian decoration established by President Truman to honor exceptional contributions to the war effort. The ceremony took place at Fisher Arsenal with minimal publicity. Colonel Moore, who had championed the spaced armor modification from the beginning, presented the medal. The citation noted that Cutting's innovation had saved numerous American lives and significantly improved the combat effectiveness of American armored forces. Fisher Arsenal also received the Army-Navy E Award for Excellence in Production, partially due to the rapid implementation of the spaced armor program. The award banner hung in the main assembly building for years after the war ended. Cutting kept the Medal for Merit in a drawer at home. He rarely showed it to anyone. When asked about his achievement years later, he would shrug and say the same thing every time. I just tried to solve a problem. Other people were a lot braver than me. They were the ones getting shot at. The war ended in Europe on May 8, 1945, in the Pacific on August 15, following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The massive industrial mobilization that had transformed America into the arsenal of democracy began winding down almost immediately. Tank production ceased. Defense contracts were cancelled. Workers were laid off by the millions. Fisher Arsenal, which had employed over 40,000 workers at peak production, shrank to a skeleton maintenance staff by late 1946. The facility closed entirely in 1948. Its buildings converted to other industrial uses. Robert Cutting returned to civilian welding work, finding employment at a General Motors plant in Flint. He never worked in defense production again. He never sought publicity for his wartime contribution. He lived quietly with his wife and 2 children in a modest house on the outskirts of Flint. He welded automotive components for 30 more years until retiring in 1976. He died in 1989 at the age of 78, outliving most of the men whose lives he had saved. The story of the spaced armor modification faded from public consciousness as the war generation aged and passed away. Military historians occasionally mentioned it in technical studies of tank development. Armor engineers knew about it as an important precedent in the evolution of vehicle protection, but the general public never learned about the welder who saved hundreds of lives with a simple idea that the experts had ignored. Yet the impact of Cutting's work extended far beyond World War II. The principle of spaced armor became fundamental to modern tank design. Every main battle tank developed since 1945 incorporates some form of spaced armor or reactive armor to defeat shaped charge weapons. The American M1 Abrams tank uses composite armor with multiple layers separated by air gaps. The Israeli Merkava tank features modular spaced armor that can be replaced after battle damage. The Russian T-series tanks use explosive reactive armor that detonates outward to disrupt incoming shaped charge jets. All of these sophisticated systems trace their conceptual ancestry back to Robert Cutting, welding quarter-inch steel plates onto standoff brackets in a Detroit factory in November 1943. The technology evolved, becoming more complex and effective, but the underlying principle remained constant, disrupting the shaped charge jet before it reaches the main armor saves lives. This lesson, learned through hard experience and validated by one welder's determination to solve a problem, continues to protect tank crews in modern conflicts. The human cost of innovation in warfare is always measured in lives saved versus lives lost. For every Robert Cutting who developed a protection system, there were countless engineers designing more effective weapons. The shaped charge technology that threatened American tankers in 1943 became the basis for modern anti-tank missiles, rocket-propelled grenades, and improvised explosive devices. The ongoing competition between armor and anti-armor weapons continues today, with each generation of protection spawning a new generation of threats. But within this grim calculus of military technology, there remains space for individual courage and initiative. Robert Cutting was not a general or a famous scientist. He held no advanced degrees. He commanded no troops. He simply saw a problem, developed a solution, and refused to accept bureaucratic dismissal. His persistence, supported by Supervisor Patterson's willingness to bend rules and Colonel Moore's readiness to champion practical innovation, created a chain of events that saved thousands of lives. The lesson transcends the specific technical details of spaced armor and Sherman tanks. Innovation in crisis requires institutional flexibility. The military organizations that win wars are not necessarily those with the most advanced technology at the start, but those that can adapt most quickly when their assumptions prove wrong. The American military-industrial complex of World War II succeeded not because it started with superior equipment, but because it created systems that allowed good ideas from unexpected sources to be tested, validated, and implemented rapidly. Robert Cutting's story illustrates this adaptability. His initial proposals were rejected through normal channels, a failure of bureaucracy that could have cost thousands of lives. But the system contained escape valves, Patterson's willingness to conduct unauthorized tests, Moore's authority to order field trials. The Armored Force Board's focus on practical results rather than procedural compliance. These informal mechanisms allowed a good idea to survive despite initial rejection. Modern military organizations still struggle with this balance between standardization and innovation. Established procedures ensure quality and reliability, but rigid adherence to procedures can prevent necessary adaptation. The challenge is creating institutional cultures that maintain standards while remaining open to unconventional solutions from unexpected sources. Robert Cutting could have been any skilled worker in any industry, noticing a problem and conceiving a solution. The fact that the system eventually listened to him, tested his idea, and implemented it rapidly represents institutional success despite initial failure. The men who survived, Panzerfaust hits because of spaced armor, never met Robert Cutting. Most never learned his name. They knew only that their tank had been hit, that they had heard the explosion and felt the impact, and that somehow they had survived. They climbed out of their tanks, checked for damage, and continued fighting. Many went on to experience the horrors and triumphs of the final year of war. They participated in the liberation of concentration camps, witnessed the destruction of German cities, celebrated victory in the streets of European towns. They returned home to build families and careers in post-war America. Their children and grandchildren exist because a welder in Detroit refused to accept that nothing could be done. This is the ultimate measure of innovation in warfare. Not the elegance of the engineering solution or the sophistication of the technology, but the simple count of lives preserved. 817 documented tank survivals, approximately 3,000 to 5,000 crew members who lived instead of dying, families that remained intact, children who were born to fathers who otherwise would have been killed in 1944. The ripple effects of these saved lives extended through generations, touching thousands of descendants who owe their existence to a modification they have never heard of. Robert Cutting's story deserves to be remembered not as a tale of technological triumph, but as an example of individual responsibility in the face of institutional inertia. He saw young men dying unnecessarily. He developed a solution. He persisted despite rejection. He took personal risk to prove his concept. These actions required no special genius, only the moral courage to act when action was difficult and uncertain. The American workers who built the arsenal of democracy during World War II numbered in the millions. They welded ships and assembled aircraft, and machined gun barrels, and loaded ammunition. Most performed their assigned tasks competently without making unique contributions. Robert Cutting was different only in his refusal to accept that his assigned task was sufficient. He looked beyond his welding torch to see the larger problem. He thought beyond his immediate responsibilities to imagine a solution. He acted beyond his authority to prove that solution worked. These are qualities that every generation needs in every field of human endeavor. The problems change, but the essential challenge remains constant. Identifying real problems, developing practical solutions, and overcoming institutional resistance to implement those solutions. Sometimes the most important contributions come from unexpected people in unexpected places. A welder in a tank factory, a clerk in a supply depot, a mechanic in a maintenance shed. Anyone who sees clearly, thinks independently, and acts courageously can change history. The Sherman tanks that fought across Europe and the Pacific from 1944 to 1945 carried more than guns and armor. They carried the accumulated ingenuity of thousands of workers who found better ways to build, protect, and employ them in combat. Robert Cutting's spaced armor was one thread in this larger tapestry of innovation, but it was a thread that saved lives, and in the final accounting of any war, that is the only measure that truly matters. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.